Thank you very much for inviting me to your very important conference. My name is David Hung from the National Institute of Education, Singapore, Nanyang Technological University. Today, the presentation that I would like to make to all of us is Seizing the Opportunities for Educational Reforms, Reflections on Education, Technology, and the Way Ahead. Now, we know that in the COVID-19 scenarios of the pandemic that we are still currently in, we are thankful that we still have good health and we're still able to have this conference. But it has shaken to some extent the way we conduct schooling, and that these new norms have given us opportunities for us to reflect on how education is conducted and the function of educational technology in the way ahead, going for us, not just in education, but for education systems in general. I would like to say that recently, not just for the COVID-19, there has been a blurring of lines between formal and informal learning. We know that learning, as far as a child is concerned, does not end at the school curriculum and does not end with school timings. And it happens throughout the lifespan of kids. And the informal spaces become more important because we are trying to institute what we call lifelong learning in our children. The distinctions between academic and vocational is also blurring, as we can see the rise of applied learning, experiential learning, and maker spaces. And we also now see a greater synergy between the cognitive and the affective. And it's not just what happens in the mind, but really what happens mind and body in an embodied fashion. And more recently, we have all experienced the blurring of lines between the physical and the virtual. We have all also experienced that too much of the virtual can also be a fatigue, and there is really a need for complementarity of both physical and virtual worlds. The recent rise of AI has also been with us. Perhaps the fashion has gone on very strongly with industry pushing, but I would also like to say that the traditional ways in which we do education and learning is probably a lot more culturally situated and founded than we can imagine. So if we take this 2x2 matrix, on the one hand, the difference between human and non-human, and on the other hand, adaptive and hardwired, then we see these 4 quadrants as far as the rise of AI is concerned. And I think what we want to really feature in education is how AI can be augmented with human intelligence. So extant literature tells us that there is a first-order infrastructural concern as far as putting technology into schools is concerned. And in Singapore's experience from Master Plan 1 to Master Plan 4 right now, we have had significant investments into infrastructure. The second order, which I would like to emphasize, which is as important or even more important than infrastructural concerns, is the design competencies of teachers and school leaders that enable the instruction to take place. And of course, the third order, in my view, is after we put in infrastructure, design competencies to do the kinds of technological, pedagogical content knowledge of teachers necessary to design 21st century inquiry learning, we need to sustain these interventions because there is a change in curriculum mapping and schemes of work with respect to inquiry relative to more direct instructional approaches. So how do we sustain these things? What would be group size considerations? What would be class size considerations? What would be ways in which we need to equip our teachers' competencies in order to do these in a sustainable fashion? Now, the question for us, of course, that I would like to address also in this presentation is how these 3 orders come together in a systemic fashion, because the Singapore's education system is an opportunity to put policy, pedagogy, and enactment in classrooms all in a coherent fashion. And I argue that even with the rise of AI and these experiences that we have gained in ICT inquiry practices in the past decade can inform us of the way ahead, even when we are now encouraged towards a greater personalization and customization of learning. So what we have understood when we had consultants come to evaluate the master plans that we have had in Singapore was that school change and school culture is the overriding enabler for the sustainability of ICT-based pedagogical practices. So here in this slide, you will see an example of how a school classroom, typically 35 to 40 students, is basically almost looking as if it's a bit disorderly. But trust me, there's a lot of good chaos happening in this classroom. And the children right now are using mobile devices, interwoven between the classroom and outside classroom experiences in order to make science inquiry something more authentic and meaningful to them. So we see on the top left-hand corner here, 2 teachers from 6 different schools coming together, paired out 2 by 2, and a more experienced teacher who has gone through this particular intervention in the past, now apprenticizing these teachers in their lesson co-designs in order to create the kinds of inquiry-based practices that you see on the right here. And then these paired teachers go back to their respective schools in the picture below, and they work with the department, in this case science, to situate this inquiry practice as part of the school's vision and mission, and then situating it into their department's so-called scheme of work in order to create these sustainable lessons that you would see for inquiry-based practices where technology plays a part. So let me just, at this stage, share with you a study that we have made, looking through this cluster-based school, cluster-based meaning school-to-school network model, where teachers across these schools come together and what the principles are to enable the 3 orders, first, second, and third orders that I mentioned earlier, in a systemic fashion, in an integrated and coherent manner. So what happens here is that at the school level, the teachers come together to work the talk, as you have seen in the earlier slide, where the teachers came together to co-design lessons. And in working the talk, teachers are at the heart of this change process. And I argue that teachers are at the heart of the change process for the entire system and not just within the classroom. So in this presentation and this model, I want to show to us all that the principles that happen in the classroom, in the school, is kind of recursively occurring at every level of the Singapore's education school system in order to create a sustainable change from policy all the way to classroom practices. So in working the talk, the teachers come together in the teacher design skills, and what the heads of departments in schools are needed to do is to create the protected time for the teachers to come together to co-design lessons. And in that discussion, facilitation, create an open culture where teachers are able to freely put their ideas onto the front for everybody's consideration and work through a brokering process through which, in the discussion all the way to classroom enactments, teachers' beliefs, I call it epistemic change, occurs. And when they can see their students responding to these redesigns, inquiry redesigns, they're able to come to an epistemic belief that the teachers, that putting this process in place, students are able to benefit. So at the heads of department level, what they do is that they stand in the gap between the teachers that they have and the school leaders that is above them. And so what happens in these heads of departments, personnel, is that they try to plan towards a growing of expertise. In other words, you know that sometimes teachers within a department, the number of teachers is rather thin. So they need to develop a so-called succession planning model where the development of teachers' expertise grows as a result of this entire process, and that lead teachers from other schools are able to come and participate in this change endeavor and to supplement the teachers' learning journey, because it is quite discomforting for the teachers to go through this so-called risk-taking process, because their original practice was able to deliver the kinds of performance, academic goals in examinations, which is quite needed in our school system. So the HODs stand in the gap, ecologizing between their own teachers and the school leaders. So you find that The teachers here are encouraged to have and enabled to have an open culture of trust. And here they facilitate the enactment, standing between the teachers and encouraging them and communicating this encouraging stance of the good work of the teachers to the school leaders. Now, the school network or cluster comes together and supported by the cluster superintendent in this case, and they put the school personnel, the vice principals together, and the vice principals basically form a subject-based working team where school teachers across the same subject across these schools come together and they kind of iron out the kinds of gaps that they experience in individual schools, and hopefully the other teachers from the other schools are able to come and complement or supplement the gaps that exist in a particular school. So for example, a school may have insufficient technological devices, or a school teacher might be in this school unwilling to go through this inquiry process because it's quite a difficult one to go through. And they supplement teachers from the other schools to come at the subject level, because enactments are really at the subject level whenever classroom subjects are executed in classrooms. So what happens that in this committee, they kind of facilitate the spreading of teacher beliefs. They kind of like create a culture of classroom openness where other teachers can come and observe what's happening in this enactment in that particular school. And they try to create a differentiated instruction model where the lesson plan is able to be in situ in the classrooms, adapted to different learners, and create a supportive way in which some form of evidence of learning gains can occur in this school, because school leaders will embark in a sustainable change only when there is a tangible evidence to suggest that this method actually works. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the school network comes together, the vice principals as school leaders facilitating this process comes together as a group of vice principals. And what they do is that they foster partnerships across the different schools, and also partnering with the university, like where I'm in, to be able to augment the so-called evidence part that I mentioned earlier. And they create a sustainable succession planning pipeline where teachers from other schools can help to augment what are gaps in this particular school, and to percolate the inquiry practice across the schools that are coming together in this coherent fashion. So the school teachers work at the subject level, and the school leaders work at the structural, so-called school policy level, in which both come together in order to complement a sustainable, systemic way to overcome the three barriers or three orders that I mentioned earlier. So in a nutshell, I just want to say that three defining characteristics appear in this school implementation process. Number one, systemic thinking, systemic planning. So the school-based leadership teams, just the earlier slide, came together and worked out subject by subject, department by department, how the growing of teacher expertise occurs, how curriculum mappings or remappings need to occur in order to create and to instill these inquiry-based practices in our children, how to plan the provision of devices for all the students across the schools. And you actually need to see or kind of like plan the end from the beginning, and to create a staged, as organized a fashion as possible in order to give teachers the kinds of security and safe environment to enact this journey of change. And then very importantly, this systemic thinking doesn't just occur within school leaders. Teachers themselves at the classroom level need to think systemically, because the classroom routines and the classroom management norms would have to be changed in order to reach this end goal through which they want their children to undergo. So this framework, the levels in which I'm articulating, the principles occur at every level of the school system, whether it be at the classroom, whether it be at the heads of department level, or whether it be at the school level, or whether it be at the school cluster level. The second important skill set is ecological brokering. So just now, as I mentioned to you, the HODs ecologically broker between the teachers and the principals. You'll find that at every level of the system, teachers need to communicate upwards, especially the East Asian cultures in which we are in, where we give a lot of deference to power. And so we tend not to communicate upwards. And when we do not communicate upwards, policies come fast and furious from the top down, and they sometimes overturn the good efforts that are happening at the ground level. So we need to build teachers at every level of the system to be ecological brokers, able to broker upwards, downwards, and sidewards amongst their peers. And then finally, a very important principle that came across is apprenticeship learning. In other words, because teachers are doing something out of their comfort zones, but we know that evidence suggests that it works, the whole entire process of teacher learning has to be apprenticized. Now, I've appropriated this concept called leadership from the middle, as far as Michael Fullen and Andy Hargreaves, which we have invited for this conference, have come up with. But as you can see from this definition, leadership from the middle is actually invoking, as a whole system, the middle layer, which is the district level. In Singapore, we haven't got districts, but we have got school clusters. And in this case, we are invoking the school cluster level as the middle between MOE, the Ministry of Education, and schools, and using the school cluster level as a mediating, brokering platform that ties between what happens in schools and what is required at the Ministry of Education. Now, I argue in my work that leadership from the middle occurs at every level of the system, and not just macroly as the school district or school cluster between the MOE and the schools. At every middle, I mean that in the school, at the school level, you'll find that the middle is actually the HODs. Now, at the cluster of schools level, the middle is actually the schools, right? So you'll find that if I can use this model all the way to the classroom level, the whole classroom is the system, the students are the recipients, and the teachers are the ones that mediate between the whole entire school classroom culture that leads to the goal for which the lessons are aimed at. And they are standing in the middle between the students and the instructional goals in which they are advocating. So this notion of systemic thinking, ecological brokering, and apprenticeship learning occurs at every middle of the system, at every level. So I think for that reason, I argue that the framework in which I have deepened the nuances of leadership from the middle is a powerful construct, because if we can develop the kinds of skill sets needed by teachers in terms of systemic thinking, logical brokering, and apprenticeship learning, come what may, AI and even advancements beyond AI, school teachers and school leaders would be able to handle or to cope or to take advantage of the kinds of technologies that are presented in these current times. So I would like to now step one step back and to articulate 5 tenets for change and sustainability, AI or otherwise, and that is pathways, policies, pedagogies, prioritizations, and partnerships. First, pathways. In our work, we notice that as schools come together and as teachers come together within these schools, there is a real need for coordinating what would be the end goal. And for example, the end goal would to convince policymakers that this method works. But of course, we know that all this works for the benefit of the students, and these students come with varying differentiations, varying social economic status, varying abilities to pay attention, for example. And so how do we actually create, with a view to that end goal, structures and mechanisms within these networks of schools and networks of teachers within these networks of schools in order to reach that end? And how do we actually plan for the teacher growing of expertise in order to meet that end in mind? And so in our work, we realized that this growing of expertise is very much a socialization process. And so as schools come together, they develop the kinds of trust and culture to engender this inquiry-based practices in 21st CC in schools. and then school leaders coming together to support them because evidence suggests that it works. And even if the evidence is not fully fleshed out, there is this implicit trust that the teachers know that their students are benefiting, especially the lower progressing ones, especially the ones who are not doing very well with respect to the traditional ways in which instruction is catered to a classroom of 1:35 students. Okay, and so the network grows and the structures of school support and school teachers learning becomes interwoven, and then the spreading of these practices occur outwards to more and more teachers and more schools. Now, I must say that this socialization process cannot be underestimated, because I argue that it is the pathway that moves from policy all the way to practice in the classrooms. Whilst MOE, the Ministry of Education, can come out with curriculum examples, curriculum lesson plans, and can come out with artifacts to show, and even videos to show that these things work. By the nature that schools and teachers are very busy individuals, you need to put in place how all these artifacts and evidence to suggest it works travels into the networks and to the teacher learning processes of our school teachers and school leaders. The second is not to underestimate the notion that good policy matters. So in our school system in Singapore, the Ministry of Education as a system curates, as I mentioned earlier, the point-attable examples, the good practices, documenting it across schools, how it happens, the design principles that occur within these practices, and the teacher policies that enable the learning to take place. And then the policies get translated to the curriculum level, and this skill set needed for teachers to do curriculum mapping among themselves relative to their timetablings and their scheme of work, and how these design principles can be enacted in terms of real teaching, student-centered enactments in classrooms and within their subject disciplines, and then how the schools themselves would implement these implementations relative to their overarching school vision and mission, and how the school leaders work together in order to support the teachers in this process. So while the first is the pathway that moves from policy to practice, here I show you from a system perspective what the supporting enablements are at the ministry, and it moves to the school cluster and down to the schools. And then there's the important third notion of pedagogies, where there is a systematic curation and understanding of what are the kinds of learning principles that occur within subject disciplines, such as the use of multiple representations to enable conceptual meaning making, how to alleviate or mediate cognitive load of students, because not all students have a high cognitive load, for example. How do we use linguistic scaffolds in order to prime disciplinary thinking, so on and so forth. Okay, and this is important understandings, but it got to be situated into the teachers' understandings of how to translate it into classroom practices. And then we have pedagogies also with respect to assessment and 21st CC, and increasingly we are now figuring out beyond the content dimensions of knowledge, we need to figure out also the cognitive aspects of students, and then the social emotional well-being of their students. So assessment here now becomes more supported by AI, for example. Recently in schools, we have got schools that basically capture day by day and over months the social emotional well-being of students. And then we can kind of figure out students' stress levels relative to the task engagements in which they are subjected, so-called, to. And then we can see that there are varying stress dimensions of students in terms of individual differences, because the same degree of stress given to a student could be seen as a challenge by another student. So how do we actually use all these different assessment indicators and proxies to give us a more holistic understanding as we try to augment what the teacher does with respect to what technology can enable teachers in terms of decision making, and school leaders as far as understanding the trajectory of their learning outcomes are for their students. And then we can also now move into the augmentation between human and artificial learning. As we can see here, these three circles that I've drawn, between learning and human cognition, the important aspect of intuitive resources. We have got projects, research grants that show to us that when lower progress students are able to use authentic experiential learning experiences, and even the way in which they engage in embodied gestorial actions, the very process in which learning and meaning is constructed through enactments and gestorial actions, create the intuitive knowledge that they bring to in their lived experiences as they bring it to their classrooms. And so recently we also have had students work in after-school programs where they work on tinkering, schools partnering with the university and also with the Science Center and social service agencies, where we work with lower track students in many hands-on science inquiry activities for which inquiry resources are developed in the kids, in the students, and these inquiry resources we conjecture to be an important meaning-making mediation process as we bring learning from concrete to abstract trajectories. So this is an important notion because we cannot underestimate the whole arena of intuitive resources. Between learning and artificial cognition, we know that there is something that machine learning can help generate, and machine learning can possibly come out with patterns of phenomena, and these patterns of phenomena could actually inform both teachers and students with respect to their engagement in the learning process. But we are quite a long way as far as a distance as far as using machine learning that can be trusted by teachers as they enact lessons with their kids. So we have got AI vendors that come to our schools, but because sometimes what happens in the AI is a black box. Teachers do not so-called trust AI machine learning algorithms. So we do need to have a lot more teacher literacy as far as AI is concerned. And then between human and artificial cognition, we can see how cognitive processes can be augmented with artificial augmentation, so much so that if we can assume the use of tools and other devices, especially for low progress students, where we perhaps might conjecture that they might have a so-called cognitive load that's lower than higher ability students, then can these so-called machine augmentations be part and parcel of their learning process and even taken into examination halls if necessary. But again, these are a long way from the kinds of institutional practices in which we have had in the last 5 decades of our education system. But I think what's important in my diagram here is right in the middle here of these 3 circles. What is in the intersectional middle of these 3 circles, which technology and AI can leverage on, are these tools, science, algorithms, artifacts, knowledge, information curated from individuals and communities that can help inform learning pathways and trajectories and enable learning to be visible for teachers' decision-making and the design of instruction, and for learning to be scaffolded in self-improving ways, so much so that what is learned in conceptual understandings can be brought to transferable application in students' learning and in authentic ways. Now, if that is the case, then perhaps we can have this model here, this diagram here, can better unpack the distinctions between human and artificial learning or cognition. And in a way, we might be able to have a better predictive models to help teachers know how to manage and orchestrate the learning process for these students in their differentiated fashions, and also in their different pathways in which the goal of our instruction is hopefully to be meted out, because we are actually increasingly moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach. And if we can bring greater personalization and customization to the learning process, and machine learning and artificial intelligence can help us, of course, that would be a good thing. But there must be, number one, trusted relationships between the machine and the teachers whom we argue to be a critical component of any education system, and that I personally do not think that they would be replaced, because I think we are moving away we're moving away from content learning per se, but to how environments can be orchestrated and developed for the benefit of all students in Sundry. So as we move on, I just want to emphasize that as we do many things in a system, where teachers have to cope with technology, teachers have to cope with AI, teachers have to cope with the science of learning, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, what really happens is that how all these many things and many achievements, much of science is able to translate into design elements, and that teachers might be able to take these so-called inventions that we have come up with in research and in technology to bring it to the lesson enactments for the benefit of students. I think if we can have all these structures in support of the most important layer, which is the layer of where the rubber hits the road, where the teacher works with students and to create the kinds of scaffolds and designs to maximize the potential of the learner, I think that's where the entire prioritization of our efforts should be headed towards. And so finally, in order to do this, I think schools and teachers cannot work by themselves. And I illustrated earlier that partnerships are a key important role in this entire process. But I think in my own experience of forging partnerships and working with schools, identifying the problem is very important. Otherwise, the partnerships will not sustain. And then partnerships need to come up with a hypothesis. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the solution? A hypothesis that this could be the pathway that leads to a sustainable approach to solving this instructional goal in which, or learning goal in which we are trying to together work on. And without a hypothesis, sometimes we are hitting too many things, and often because we have no prioritization of what we think can be research informed and what would be improvement cycles we can put in place, very often the partnerships do not end up in a very fruitful fashion. And then we leverage on these partners, each with its own strengths, in order to work out a plan of action in order to help the end goal, which is to help these many differentiated learners to achieve their maximum learning outcomes. And then once we are able to come up with a prototypical proof of concept, we then work with agencies that will be able to scale up in an organized and systematic fashion how to enable more and more students to benefit from this innovation. So finally, my last slide, I'd just like to conclude that by introducing a term for everyone. So just now I mentioned the leadership from the middle model, where all teachers at every level require systemic thinking, ecological brokering, and apprenticeship learning. I would like to first say that we are probably not unfamiliar with the word localization. Localization means we need to have a global perspective, yet remaining very local. In other words, the local being where the rubber hits the road, where the teacher is able to effectively design lessons to cater to the needs of learners. That's the very local end in which we are trying to achieve, and how technology plays that complementary augmented role, AI or otherwise, in this entire process. But what I realized is that localization might not sufficiently and adequately connote this need to work in an interdisciplinary partnership fashion, where we need to create that ecosystem where what we do, the intervention that and innovation that we put in place, is able to then subsequently leverage on the ecosystem of partners. And now teachers need to invest their abilities to forge such partnerships together, of course, with school leaders, which play a very important role, both within the school and across schools, and also with partners in the ecosystem, such as the university, such as the science center, such as social service agencies, such as even after-school programs where agencies come in. We work together in order to head towards the same outcome and be able to find a sustainable ecosystem, okay, to make things work in the long term. for the benefit of all students. So hence, I'd like to conclude by introducing this term called eco-localization. And my argument is that AI, which can benefit, hopefully benefit all of us, benefit teachers and schools, first requires teachers and school leaders to have an eco-localization mindset and ability in order to embrace all these things, and then to situate these very eco-localization competencies in students so that come what may, advantages and disadvantages, advantages of technology, disadvantages such as the pandemic today, we might be able to come forth with achieving what the purpose and goals of education are for the betterment of all our students, especially the ones who are lower progressing, the ones who might be lagging behind. And if we are able to put all our efforts together, especially targeted to help our lower progress students, I believe all students will ultimately benefit. Thank you very much.